Jim Anthony with Indiana Responsible Gun Owners here, and we are going to review Antonio Turner v. State of Indiana. This is a case that was just argued in June and decided in March, which at this point is about 2 weeks ago. Very interesting case. We're going to have some fun with this right here and right now. This opinion was delivered by Justice Moulter. Let's jump right into some of this background, see what's going on here. This is a case about a good guy with a gun shooting a bad guy with a gun, when the only choices were to shoot or be shot. Antonio Turner was one of 3 students studying chemistry over at a classmate's home on the east side over in the Lawrence area, just outside of Indianapolis. And while they were studying, the classmate's jealous love interest, so there was a gal named Grice there I think it was her home. She had a jealous boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, Daquan Briscoe, and he repeatedly called her. And when he learned that Turner was there, he twice threatened to pull up on Turner. So Briscoe threatened to pull up on Turner, attack him. Turner overheard those threats on the speakerphone, so he took them seriously enough that shortly after he went out to his car, and then he went out to his car to get his handgun. And then as he's coming back to the house, he senses an unfamiliar car screeching toward him down the sleepy street. It's a dead-end cul-de-sac street. And some of the testimony pointed out that that car was sitting 5 houses down away from Grice's and revving its engines. And then it comes speeding down the street, squealing its tires, and comes to an abrupt stop right there at the end of the driveway where Turner's standing. I think pretty reasonably, Turner thought, I'm in trouble. This is not good. Since he didn't have time to get to the house and he really didn't have anywhere to hide, he kind of turned while he was running and he fired 4 shots into the car. And he wounded Briscoe. Turns out Briscoe was in that vehicle and he hit Briscoe, I guess, once in each arm. Turner fired based on his intuition. This is where it starts to get interesting. He sensed or he believed or his intuition told him, yeah, that's definitely Briscoe in there. He didn't know the car, and he couldn't see in the car because it had darkly tinted windows. So this creates an objective reasonableness challenge here. And he wouldn't have recognized Briscoe because he didn't know Briscoe. So even if he saw him, he wouldn't know if it was him, the guy that threatened him on the phone just moments ago. But it was his intuition that made the decision, and it proved to be accurate. So it turns out Briscoe was in the car. Now, this opinion says he was aiming the gun. I don't think that was actually established. I think what the trial court judge said is he definitely had a gun in the vehicle, and the trial court concluded that the gun was drawn and that Briscoe did have bad intent, but I don't believe aiming the handgun was ever proven. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So it was believed that Briscoe was going to shoot Turner just before Turner began firing into the vehicle. So because Turner shot Briscoe and before Briscoe could shoot Turner, Turner's the one charged with a crime and is the defendant in this case instead of being a victim who got shot. And then the state charged Turner with battery by means of a deadly weapon, which is a level 5 felony. In Indiana, we have 6 levels of felony. So this is not the lowest level. There's a pretty serious charge here. And then it went to a bench trial in front of a magistrate judge. And that judge convicted Turner of this crime, in spite of the fact that the judge agreed with Turner that in hindsight, it was necessary for Turner to fire at Briscoe to avoid being shot. However, the judge rejected Turner's self-defense justification because without the benefit of hindsight, it was objectively unreasonable for Turner to fire at a car into which he couldn't see. So the whole case kind of hinges right here. This trial court does not understand how we determine objective reasonableness or objective unreasonableness. And you're going to find here in a minute that the court and the prosecution even agree that Turner was subjectively reasonable, but they believe Turner was objectively unreasonable, and therefore he wasn't justified and he was guilty of a crime. The problem is what they think determines objectively reasonable or unreasonable is not accurate. They don't understand how the law determines that. And the Supreme Court mentions in this opinion what objective reasonableness is, and I'll show you that. But they believe Turner was objectively unreasonable to fire into that car when he couldn't see inside because of those dark tinted windows, and he didn't know Briscoe anyway, and he couldn't see a gun. The judge goes on and says Turner made the best choice, the judge explained, and it's just unfortunate that his only choices were a felony or a funeral. So Turner did basically the best choice, the right thing, but his only legal choices basically are to go to prison or die. And he says this paradox followed from the objective reasonableness standard governing Indiana's self-defense law. And this is just flat out wrong. First of all, there is no paradox here. The only reason he thinks there's a paradox here is because he doesn't understand how we determine objective reasonableness. So we'll take a look at that. But the judge believes that the law gave him no choice but to convict, and that's just not the case. We will see that in a minute. But here's the Indiana Supreme Court now. This is the trial court judge up here. So the Indiana Supreme Court says, fortunately for Turner, that is not how Indiana self-defense law functions. To be sure, the judge is correct that self-defense statute justifies using force when the defendant's actions are objectively reasonable in the circumstances. And many cases explain we don't use hindsight to second guess the reasonableness of a defendant's decisions. But this is where, again, it gets a little weird here. The Indiana Supreme Court says, but this case presents a question of first impression in Indiana. Do we deprive defendants of the benefit of hindsight when it reveals their conduct was indeed necessary in self-defense, even though that necessity wasn't fully apparent in the moment? He couldn't see inside the car. He couldn't see a gun. But in hindsight, it turns out he was accurate. Briscoe was in the car and he did have a gun. So the Supreme Court's saying this is a question of first impression. Do we deprive a defendant of the benefit of hindsight when it turns out to prove the defendant was right? And my perspective is that there shouldn't be a question of first impression here. Hindsight should not have any place in this conversation. And Turner's belief that his force was necessary does not have to be fully apparent according to the law. It has to be reasonable, subjectively and objectively reasonable. So the Supreme Court goes on to say, no, we do not deprive defendants of the benefit of hindsight. And we base this answer on a sentence in the self-defense statute that our Indiana appellate courts have never interpreted before, making this the question of first impression. And that sentence says, no person, employer, or estate of a person in this state shall be placed in a legal jeopardy of any kind whatsoever for protecting the person or a third person by reasonable means necessary. And again, my take on this is the reason they've never interpreted this sentence before is because this sentence is not the operative sentence of the self-defense statute that should be used to justify Turner's behavior or his decision. And I'll show you what sentence should have been used. So they haven't interpreted this sentence before because it's pretty much the least relevant of the three sentences in 3541.3.2 subsection C. This is not the sentence I'd use to defend Turner's actions. So the question is, okay, what sentence should we use? What argument should we make that would eliminate this question of first impression, would eliminate the need to invoke hindsight, and would justify Turner's actions based on those circumstances he was dealing with in that moment? So let's take a look at that. So this is the use of force statute. It's 3541.3.2. It is subsection C, and these are the three sentences that get referred to in this opinion. And this third sentence down here is the one that they've been talking about, which I think is kind of the least relevant sentence to defend Turner's belief and his actions. So the first sentence is kind of the reasonable force sentence. And then this second one is the deadly force, use of deadly force. And then this third sentence is the legal jeopardy sentence. What I believe needed to happen here is like this third sentence doesn't really mean anything if we haven't first justified Turner's behavior. So these first two sentences get used all the time because they actually directly speak to when you are justified to use reasonable force or deadly force. The third sentence doesn't speak to justification, and as everybody knows, justification is the foundation of self-defense argument. I think it's one of the main reasons why the third sentence doesn't get used, because it doesn't justify Turner's actions. It just says that you're not in legal jeopardy if you use reasonable means to defend yourself. Well, that's not going to be true if the law doesn't discern that you were justified in using your force. So we're going to focus on this second sentence here and take a look at this. And we're going to take a look at the definition of forcible felony, because this is exactly what Turner was facing in the moment, and what would justify Turner's behavior without using hindsight, without bringing this question of first impression. Well, the answer is that second sentence. So here's what it says. It says, however, a person is justified to use deadly force and does not have a duty to retreat if he reasonably believes that his force is necessary to prevent serious bodily injury to himself or another, or to prevent a forcible felony. So what we have to do is take this sentence and combine it with this definition of forcible felony. Well, what's a forcible felony? Because the sentence says he's justified to use deadly force to prevent the commission of a forcible felony. So he's justified to use deadly force to prevent a use or threat of force where there's an imminent danger of bodily injury. That's what Turner was justified to prevent with deadly force, if he reasonably believed that his force was necessary. And when we say he can prevent serious bodily injury or prevent a forcible felony, we've got to be clear about this. It doesn't say he can stop himself from being harmed after the harm has already begun. No, it says he can prevent it from happening. He can stop it before it starts. He doesn't have to wait for the window to go down and a gun to come out and the guy to start shooting at him. No, if he reasonably believes he's facing a use or threat of force where he's about to be seriously harmed or killed, he's allowed to prevent that, not just stop it after it starts. So what's interesting about the argument here is that when we looked at the oral arguments here in front of the Supreme Court, because the trial court tried to say that Turner was not facing an imminent use of unlawful force, a reasonable person would not have acted as Turner did. And they're saying that because Turner couldn't see inside the car. Turner couldn't see the gun. So he didn't have an imminent threat. Therefore, shooting in the vehicle wasn't reasonable. And so the justice asked this prosecution, well, why wasn't it an imminent threat? I mean, the justice went on to say, do you dispute the defendant was scared to death? And so the prosecution agreed that, well, Turner's fear did establish the subjective reasonableness. So clearly Turner genuinely was concerned that he was going to be harmed. So the subjective reasonableness, even the prosecution agrees with that. And the trial court agreed with that. So really the only question left now is, was he objectively reasonable? And what the prosecution is saying here is that the problem for Turner is that he did not know it was Briscoe. He didn't know Briscoe. He didn't know Briscoe's car. He couldn't see inside the car. He couldn't see a gun. So he did not know it was Briscoe. He guessed. He assumed. The reality of the law is he didn't have to know. The law doesn't require him to know. The law requires Turner to reasonably believe that Turner's force was necessary because he really believed he was in imminent danger of being harmed. The trial court and the prosecution are putting too heavy a legal burden on Turner. They're putting a burden on Turner that the law does not require. Turner didn't have to know it was Briscoe. He had to reasonably believe that his force was necessary to prevent himself from being harmed or killed. So the judge said he understood the law constraining him to convict Turner because Turner couldn't see in the car. Turner couldn't see a gun, but that's not what the law requires. The law requires that he reasonably believes he's about to be harmed. And they already agreed up here that he has that belief subjectively. So how do we get from subjective reasonableness to objective reasonableness? Well, the Supreme Court explains that here. The court says that subjectively, the defendant must actually believe the force is necessary. Okay, we already have that. The trial court, the prosecution, everybody agrees Turner was subjectively reasonable. He actually believed it. Now look at this. Objectively, that belief must be one that a reasonable person would form given the circumstances. Let's be clear about what this is saying here. To go from subjective to objective, you basically need to just get another person who we all consider to be reasonable, and given that same set of circumstances, that other person would say, yeah, I would form that same belief. That's all that's required to establish objective reasonableness. Well, we already have that because the judge said during the trial that he might not have done the same thing, which I submit is a pretty good example of objective reasonableness. The Supreme Court said to be objectively reasonable, Turner's belief, which the court already said was subjectively reasonable, must be one that a reasonable person, a third party, objective reasonable person, would also form given those same set of circumstances. It doesn't say here that somebody else has to believe what Turner believed by knowing more than Turner knew. Somebody else would believe it too if they could see inside the car or see a gun. No, that's not what this says. This says that if we agree that Turner was subjectively reasonable, then to become objectively reasonable, somebody else would form the same opinion given what Turner knew in those circumstances. The judge is placing too heavy a burden on Turner because he's requiring him to see more, to know more than he knew when he was subjectively reasonable to achieve that level of objective reasonableness. And that's not what the law requires. So the judge is really placing a burden on Turner that he shouldn't have to meet. And he never would have been convicted if this standard of objective reasonableness was properly understood at the time of the trial. So let's go back to the very beginning of the oral arguments here. The very first question that the Chief Justice asked here is, what's the legal error that this trial court made? Because we're talking about the Supreme Court. They've appealed this conviction all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's not going to retry the case based on all the evidence and the witnesses. No. They're going to look for what is the matter of law that we need to deal with here. We're not looking at the facts. We're looking at the law. What's the legal error the trial court made? When the judge said, I have no choice but to convict, why is that legally incorrect? What's the legal standard here? So that's the very first thing. And I thought it was kind of funny because right at the beginning of those oral arguments, I thought if somebody would have just answered her question very clearly right here at the very beginning of oral arguments, these arguments would have lasted 5 minutes, maybe 10. Instead of 40 or 50 minutes. But I don't think there was a good solid answer. And I think the right answer is that the legal error that the trial court made was that the judge is requiring certainty, but the law only requires reasonable belief. So the trial court judge is imposing a higher or a heavier legal burden on Turner than the law does. That's the legal error here. The trial court judge basically declared that Turner's behavior was unreasonable because he couldn't see inside the car. So the judge is requiring Turner to be certain that he's going to be harmed, and then he's going to let Turner defend himself. But the legal standard is reasonableness, not certainty. And that reasonableness is determined by the totality of the circumstances. The trial court agreed that Turner was subjectively reasonable based on the totality of those circumstances. So all that was required to achieve objective reasonableness was that somebody else agrees. But the judge was requiring Turner to have more information, not just have somebody else agree with him, that in his shoes they would have done the same thing. No, Turner had to know more than the totality of the circumstances to be objectively reasonable, and that is not what the law requires. So another interesting thing that happened in the oral arguments, at about 6 minutes into the oral arguments, The Chief Justice asked a very interesting, a very clarifying question. What if a DoorDash driver was coming down the street and they were late delivering, so they were moving fast or whatever? Are we going to let somebody like Turner just shoot into a car where the windows are tinted and you can't see in when a DoorDash driver pulls up in front of them? So let's process this question because it does clarify the law. It's an excellent question. Let's think for a second. What happens if a DoorDash driver inserts themselves into this storyline? Turner just got threats on the phone. Grice just told him that Briscoe carries a gun. And the nature of the threat on the phone was that I'm going to pull up on you, like drive-by shooting, ambush style threat. And then moments later, a DoorDash driver inserts himself into this storyline. And remember, this DoorDash driver would be up the street 5 doors down, revving their engine. And then they come down this dead-end street. So there's no reason to be speeding down the street because there's nowhere to go. So the DoorDash driver's revving their engines 5 doors down. Then they come down the dead-end street. They're squealing their tires. They're speeding down the street. And then they come to an abrupt stop right in front of the driveway where Turner's standing. Moments after Turner received this threat on the phone about somebody pulling up on him and the girlfriend telling him this guy has a gun, and Turner believed that threat so strongly that he went out to his car to get his gun, the answer is it's going to be a bad day for that DoorDash driver. But it doesn't change the lawfulness of Turner's behavior at all, because the requirement of Turner is that he reasonably believes that his force is necessary. That's why I said earlier, the law doesn't require Turner to know for a fact that Briscoe's in that car or that Briscoe has a gun. The law requires Turner to reasonably believe Turner's force is necessary to prevent himself from being harmed. And if a DoorDash driver pulls up in the very same manner that he was just threatened, at the very location, at that very moment, then Turner's belief is truly reasonable, and the judge and prosecution agree with that Turner subjectively, honestly believed he was going to be hurt. So this would be a terrible tragedy that somebody like a DoorDash driver gets hurt in this situation, but it does not change the lawfulness of Turner's belief or his actions. So let's wrap up this video with a little segment I call Principles and Precedents. I'm going to make more of these videos and we'll review these things at the end of each video. And the first kind of principle lesson I think that we take away from this is we need to understand the difference between subjective and objective reasonableness. Subjectively, we've got to genuinely believe we're in danger. There's an imminent danger of bodily harm, but we also have to be smart about it. There has to be an objective reasonableness to that belief. And that's pretty much based on what another person, a reasonable and prudent person who was standing in your shoes, knew what you knew in that moment. Given those circumstances, would they have formed the same belief that you did? That's something responsible gun owners need to understand. And then the question of first impression, the hindsight. I think it just seemed to me we have a compassionate Supreme Court that wants to give somebody justification when it turns out that they were in fact correct, even if the objective reasonableness is in question. And that just seems to me to be appropriate and to be right. So if it turns out in Indiana, and I think it's kind of unique to Indiana, if it turns out that your belief was accurate in hindsight, that is going to favor your justification argument. And the good news is they don't use hindsight to second guess what you did, but they will use hindsight to confirm if it does match up. So that's not a bad thing. And then I think the third kind of legal thing is the use of that legal jeopardy clause, that third sentence of the self-defense statute. And it says that no person shall be placed in legal jeopardy for protecting themselves or a third person by reasonable means necessary. So if it turns out that your means of protecting yourself were reasonable, they use that to justify that hindsight decision, that your defense was justified. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. So the personal kind of lessons learned for responsible gun owners in my mind is we've got to be good at assessing threats. We need to understand, how do we evaluate a threat? How do we decide if it is an immediate or an imminent threat? And then how do we select what actions we're going to take to defend ourselves? That takes some training. And one of the things you can do is read the USCCA Concealed Carry magazine, because they always tell stories of people that had to defend themselves. They had to assess that threat. They had to make that decision. You'll learn from their mistakes and from their successes. I highly recommend you read that magazine. It's like getting use of force experience through other people's decisions and their outcomes. And then use of force for a responsible gun owner, it's always a last resort. We always need to remember that. Anything we can do to de-escalate or retreat is almost always a good idea. Not always, if other people are in danger of being hurt, but for the most part, we want to think in those terms to avoid, de-escalate, diffuse, retreat when we can, even in a stand your ground state. That is often the wisest course of action, and we need to kind of ever keep that in our minds. And I like to encourage gun owners, when you guys come to my classes, take some time to study the law. And you're doing that right now by watching this video, which is fantastic. But we need to be smarter than most people. If we're going to carry a firearm and be willing to step up and defend, we have to understand some things that the rest of the folks in society don't need to understand. And that puts a burden on you, and it puts some risk and responsibility on you. And so we need to take a little bit of time to study case law, to study the statutes, to know how it works. And my plan is to make more videos to help with this process. So that's about all I've got for you on this particular case, Antonio Turner v. State of Indiana. I hope you found it helpful. Any questions for me, reach out to me through the Ergo website, Indiana Responsible Gun Owners at myergo, MYIRGO, myergo.com. And make sure you keep learning, get smart, and let's stay safe. Thanks for watching.